Regulators are sounding the alarm about tainted seafood in American supermarkets, but cracking down on the problem isn't quite so easy. Carol Massar and Oliver Rennick spoke to Bloomberg BusinessWeek editor Megan Murphy about this story.
I think the first thing that popped out is just in the context that we're talking about China, about where we're going in the global economy. And just this story really traces how something you don't think that much about, which is when you're eating seafood or shrimp or anything, just the chain it goes through and just where the provenance of that is and how things that you don't know can get into the food supply are getting into the food supply. And it really presents a tale of an economy that's rapidly transforming, but the knock-on effects of that and a regulatory environment that frankly leaves a lot to be desired in terms of what actually goes to our food in the finishing line.
Well, and what's interesting is here we have, the U.S. regulators, putting tariffs on Chinese shrimp, concerns about that, and the Chinese, kind of dealing with that, but they found ways to get around it, and they continue to.
Absolutely, and it really traces through that about, I don't even know if you would call them loopholes, but ways that just, they've evaded regulatory scrutiny, not from a lack of almost intentional misfeasance, but just the very fact of wanting to get stuff done and how they want to, one supply is making sure that they're fishing, that they can sort of have a robust environment and what happens there. But then the contrary effect of that is that sort of seeps in and that you don't know exactly what is going on and what is happening in the live beds of where these things are living, breathing, and the knock-on effect of sort of the effect of having a superbug possibility and coming in through this kind of stream. Exactly. And that is the concern. And it almost reads like a movie, I think, when you read this story. And it's a tale that actually we've seen play out on the big screen before, but it reads very much like that of something that seems relatively innocuous, but through lack of regulatory oversight, desire for a higher margin, higher profit, and just frankly carelessness in terms of parts of the world that have very different standards than we'd expect in sort of Europe or the U.S. or other parts of the world.
I'm really glad that you brought it to this sort of overall topic of globalization, but let's talk about the sort of the science, if you will, about what's happening, because basically there's sort of this ecosystem that exists that is getting polluted in some sense, but not in the way that we typically think about it. It's about antibiotics working its way through the system and building up in the food that we eat.
Exactly, and that's the thing. I mean, it's kind of a story about how something that is designed to be good and sort of improve the health of certain parts of the ecosystem you just described can manifest itself in ways that we don't currently have a structure in place to deal with. It sort of morphs, it develops, and it weeds its way through in a way that the current system is not designed to catch. And we've really uncovered this tale of how this is sort of filtering its way into the U.S. and filtering its way into other countries in a way that people just would never even think could happen. And particularly one of the things I really love about this story, and the cover is fantastic, but the imagery of this story of sort of pigs next to discarded medicines and discarded antibiotics, and people actually shoveling, excrement from animals into the same part of that ecosystem where shrimp and other wildlife is living and breathing. It's a fascinating tale.
It's so true. When I was reading it, I was sort of picturing like one of these like diagrams from, middle school. You're looking at
science class, right?
Arrows going. It went from here to there, and it's not pleasant when you're reading it.
Well, what's interesting is aquaculture for thousands of years worked well in China. It's just when you start to introduce antibiotics into the equation, and this is something I feel like as a society, a global society, Megan, that we're starting to be much more sensitive about the increased use of antibiotics and how it's creating these superbugs and it's creating illnesses and problems with people and creating deaths, actually.
And I think, when we go back to what Oliver said about globalization, I mean, when you talk about globalization, and we've seen this play out in elections, we've seen it played out in the Western world, we're going to see it play out in the Eastern world as well. It's just that people move at different speeds, and regulators move at different speeds, and economies are moving at very different speeds, and they will take their advantage where they can in terms of, exploiting regulatory arbitrage almost. And I think this story too is about that, where we've introduced the antibiotics there have been introduced for a specific reason that is beneficial to that part of the economy. It's just that on the end product of the economy, on the sort of more developed world side, that's where the problems are emerging. And that's going to be a tension that plays out throughout societies so much more, and it actually is really accelerating. And I think that over the next decade, it's going to be one of the biggest things is where this regulatory arbitrage, is there a need now for some sort of global oversight of particularly the sector where you have unpredictable effects of what is actually, as we've said, designed to be a good thing for an economy.